for CEOs and millionaires. I've never seen my vision be more crystal clear. Look in the mirror, see the change in who I used to be. I kept going, knew success would come eventually. But ask about me back then, they said I wouldn't make it. Nowadays they doubt less and tend to ask for favors. Poetic music, that's realness, don't let them tell you different. And if you ever lost in doubt, then follow your intuition. These words of wisdom is for those who's trying to find their purpose. Don't be living just to die, cause only death is certain. I'm working hard so I can toast to my accomplishments. Cause see, I lost it all and I ain't been the same since. I'm more focused, more ambitious, more everything. Grew up with nothing, now I appreciate the finer things. I know it's real when at the shows they ask for autographs. And now they know the name, they ain't gotta ask. Yeah. They ain't gotta ask.
All right. Welcome back. My next guest is a personal friend of mine who I've known for going on 3 decades here. Getting there. We've known each other since the late 90s. Michael Neveu. Hello, sir.
How you doing, Ben? How's it going, man?
It's going. I super excited to talk about you because I feel like we've got a lot to say and some valuable input on life, on business, on a lot of things. Just for people that obviously don't know who you are, can you give a little background of who you are and kind of a little bit of your journey and how you ended up where you are today?
Yeah. Let's see. I think I'll do the very American thing and just talk about what I do for work. I think that's a great way to introduce myself, I guess. So, as you know, man, like, a while back I used to do architecture. That's what my degree was in. Did that for a number of years. Really, really loved it. But as a profession, I found it very difficult just from a lack of stability, where there was a trade-off between doing the type of work that I really like to do versus financial stability. And so I decided I'm going to, pick that part up later in my life. And what I'm doing right now is I got into digital marketing. I'm doing that for, what are we on now? Like a little over 10 years. And a few years ago, I went to a coding boot camp. I wanted to round out some skills, especially in the tech business. Coding is modern day literacy as far as, tech goes. So did that, worked as an engineer for a little while. And now I am, really enjoying a lot of the positives that San Francisco has to offer. Just, working in the Bay. It's kind of fun. It feels like I'm in the big leagues, right? It's like if you decide to go play baseball, you might as well go play for the Yankees. You'll have to edit that out from my family from Boston, but you know what I mean. Yeah, so, doing that. And these days I'm living in West Oakland. And, there's, I don't know, it feels, it's really positive in a lot of ways, but it also feels like you're kind of at ground zero for a lot of what's going on in the country. So,
what necessarily do you mean by that as far as ground zero?
Well, I mean, I think there's the thing that we all see in the news, right? Which is there's clearly a few different visions for America that are really out there, and they're going head to head. And definitely, being in West Oakland, being right by Berkeley, being right in the Bay, you're definitely surrounded by, I'll for colloquialisms just kind of call it the progressive viewpoint, right? So, you're in the middle of that, and I think we're also at this point in history where we're at this precipice of change, where change is needed, right? So it's a very interesting thing because I feel like you're surrounded by these agents that are really pushing for change, and the question becomes: is it the right change? Is it what's actually doing what people are talking about? And you get to see a lot of these policies that are being suggested for the rest of the country, and you get to see the pros and the cons of them. And so that's what I mean. Like, literally, I walk right out my front door, and we talk about the income disparity, and like, man, you haven't seen income disparity until you've hung out in the Bay, right? Yeah. I mean, like, it's one of the wealthiest parts of the country. I think I quickly looked up some numbers last night, just that I'm not making things up while we're talking, but please take these as a little bit off the cuff. But I think it's like, if you're in like the 95th percentile nationally, you're only in the top third of income. in the Bay. Like you're basically just middle class. And on one hand, that's a good thing, right? I mean, having a high minimum wage, people getting paid, fairly for their work. I mean, these things are goals, right? I mean, I think that's really good. On the other hand, the question is like, are these things really doing the most benefit for the most people? Literally right up the street, there's just encampments of homeless people. And when I say encampments, I don't mean there's like 4 or 5 tents. I'm talking like 50 tents, 100 tents. And these people have been there for 3 years, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And it's weird because you couldn't buy a house in this neighborhood that has a hole in the roof for less than 600,000 or 700,000. And I'm talking that's with a hole in the roof. Like if you wanted something move-inable, I mean, easily more than that, right? Yeah. And I think, obviously these things are all connected. And to me, the question that I find very interesting is, are they connected? Like, are they the result of policy, or are the policies they're putting out here fighting against this because it's right in people's face?
Right.
And that's something where, again, it feels very much on the front line because, I mean, you literally go to the grocery store and you gotta drive by a tent city,
mm-hmm.
And so you can't really ignore it because this isn't something where it's, distant. And, lately, honestly, we've been getting our mail stolen a lot. We actually had a car stop in the middle of the day, broad daylight, with plates, like no attempt to hide themselves. Dude gets out with a crowbar and just starts trying to open the mailbox, right? And on one hand, it makes your instincts very like, well, law and order, like where are the police, what's going on? And I'll be honest, that is a question. But there's also this other issue, which is, well, why are they doing it? Right? Like, I mean, some of these people are literally desperate or they have nowhere to go. And like the economy's been shut down. I mean, I know nationally this is a problem, but like maybe second only to New York is California as far as like just shutting everything down. And of course, I always want to reserve a little bit of judgment only because, hey, California and New York are a little more dense than other states. So maybe there's something to shutting it down more. But on the other hand, you just look at this massive devastation that this has caused. And, and you have to ask yourself, like, are the policies that are being put in place actually helping these people? Or are these a way to, buy off some guilt, make yourself feel better about your 6-figure salary so that when you drive past the tent city, you don't feel bad?
Do you feel, because obviously a lot of tech companies are based out of the Bay Area, Palo Alto, you name it, down the street, right? Mm-hmm. Do you feel the way that the current legal system is set up for corporations and corporate personhood, that these billion-dollar companies, so to speak, aren't paying their fair share in taxes, but they essentially find the loopholes to create nonprofit entities, foundations of some kind to help promote what they feel their values
are. Hey Ben, real quick, let me they're being really loud out there. I'm having a little trouble hearing. Give me 1 second if you could repeat that. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, I just have a question in a sense of how do you feel about like some of these, obviously the tech companies are down the street. They are generating billions of dollars in cash flow and revenue, and yet the tax percentage on what they pay based on the way GAAP is and the accounting practices and things of that nature, they're not doing anything illegal per se, but these companies are basically not paying their share of taxes based on the size and the value of their companies. Do you feel that the Bay Area in some ways is catering and pandering, placating to tech and these kind of industries that have a foothold in those places, to where the disparity is pushing up faster at an accelerated rate because of they're paying people with talent that much more and squeezing everybody that's just an average Joe, that much more and that much faster? Oh,
absolutely. I mean, and this is having a devastating effect on these local communities. I mean, just again, I didn't want to be making up numbers while we're talking. I kind of knew this was going to come up, so give me a moment here. So like in SF alone, between 2018 and 2019, according to the AP News, 17% in that 1 year. In Alameda County, which hosts Oakland, so where I'm at, it went up 43%. Okay, so
Can you repeat
people
that?
can't
I'm
buy these
sorry.
houses. Oh yeah, absolutely. So in SF, homelessness went up 17% between 2018 and 2019, according to the AP News. And in Alameda County, which holds Oakland, it's gone up 43%. Right. So it cannot be overstated the damage this is doing. Right now, the problem is what they're trying to do is they're trying to simply like say, okay, well, let's use rent control. That's a big one out here. If you think rent control is strict in New York, you don't even. This is the rent control in the Bay is intense. In fact, they had a story where a family had rented their house out. It was a military family, and then they needed to move back to the Bay, and they couldn't move into their own house unless they paid the tenants. I think it was like $30,000 to like reclaim their own house.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't. I mean, I say couldn't. You know, you can raise the rent like 1 or 2% a year, but it's crazy. So what happens though is as a Band-Aid, this makes sense, right? Because you don't want people to instantly get kicked out of their house. And also I like the fact that Oakland isn't just a bunch of tech people, right? So I'm happy that they're doing something. Where I feel the flaw is that there's no exit plan, right? This becomes like our own little local version of Afghanistan, where it's just like, we're just there and we're just locking people into these rents. And it's like, well, sure, but what if the person under rent control actually needs to move at some point in the next, 10 years of their life? What if they have kids? I mean, it's very reasonable to assume some level of movement. And instead we lock these people in place. The minute they have to move, like they can't afford the area because rent control takes a lot of the limited inventory off the market. And therefore, just basic, I won't get into it, but basic capitalism, it just raises supply demand prices. You just can't get the inventory. It means that people that are owners can't rent out for a discounted price. So, if you owned a house and you were like, oh man, I want to help this family out, I'll rent it out for 30% below market. Well, sure, you could do that. But if that family doesn't move out, like you're stuck at that rate basically forever. I mean, you will never recoup that. So it means that renters are incentivized heavily to just sit on empty units until they can achieve maximum value.
Right.
And then there's very little done to actually get the people out of poverty, right? Like, I mean, not to be kind of rude here, but, I don't know, maybe the people that you're giving rent control to because, they have a job where they make you coffee in the morning or something and therefore they don't have the money. I don't know, maybe they don't want to fucking make your coffee forever. You know what I mean? Like maybe they actually want to be the person who can afford the unit. And nobody ever seems to see that. They're almost just, it's very like, oh, we're going to kind of throw dollars from our ivory tower at you to make ourselves feel better. And there's not really an engagement with the issues to truly, I don't think they're really truly trying to fix these things. That's what I find to be the biggest travesty.
Do you feel that not just in San Francisco, but just in general around the country, you've lived in other cities, obviously Denver, Austin, etc. Do you feel like we're creating some kind of caste system of some kind where you have, and I think, you've seen it with the essential workers, so to speak, of cities.
No.
The folks that have the means go to their second home or go somewhere else and hang out during what seemed to be one of the biggest, issues we've had to deal with in our country in our lifetime per se. I mean, I don't ever think the country's just stopped for a year in the way it has today. And then the people that obviously are well-to-do are, when you look at from the, when I was studying for my MBA, we're looking at consumer discretionary spending. It's through the roof. Like all these Williams-Sonoma, Restoration Hardware, all these people are having record numbers on sales. They can't keep up with the demand. Meanwhile, other people can't even go to work without, being in just in a subway and possibly being infected with somebody having to get to work because, in bigger cities, they have to use public trans to get from point A to point B to make the money that they need to make to survive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things there. Before I answer, I do want to add one little note is earlier when I said they're not trying to correct it, I'm talking about the policies. There's actually a lot of people really trying to correct things. I don't want to paint the picture that there's a lot of malicious people out here just trying to hose everybody. Although I think there are. So to your other question, I think 100%. In fact, one of my concerns about the focus that we often have in the country is that we focus on a lot of issues that I think are critically important. So it's good that we're talking about them. But what I find remarkable is the dead air around the wealth discrepancy, right? I mean, it's something that I'm like, if you were doing a little problem tree and you were stepping up saying, hey, what are the root causes, right? Like, well, why is there such an income gap? Why is there such a gap between, privileged and not privileged? Why is there such a gap between how people are treated by the police? Why is there such a gap between how people are treated by the legal system, right? And out here, I mean, a lot of people immediately say, well, it's race and all that. I mean, there's definitely a history behind that. So I'm not here to, deny that. But I feel like there's this kind of broader meta, which is, I think the middle class in this country and the poor people in this country are getting hosed. And what's happening is the ultra wealthy are kind of hiding behind the shield of capitalism, which I say that because I'm actually very pro capitalism. But the reason that I say this is because what we have right now isn't capitalism. What we have is essentially people at the top being given funds, and if they fail, they're given bailout funds, they're being backed up. But God help you if you're a small business, right? This isn't a level playing field. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like, I enjoy the game Monopoly, but if the person who's playing the bank just gives you an extra $700 a round for no reason other than they like you, well, okay, me getting mad about that doesn't mean I don't like Monopoly. It means this is loaded, And that's how I feel. And what I worry about is that we get focused on a lot of these other issues, which, again, I can't emphasize this enough, are important and worthy of discussion. But to me, the hole in the boat, the thing that's making the Titanic sink, right, the iceberg, if you will, is this wealth discrepancy. The fact that, what is it? And it's not, everybody always talks about the 1% because it's easy to say that. But really what you're talking about is the top 1% of the 1%.
Right.
Now, I don't want to go down the slippery slope of defining what is too much money. I feel like that's such an easy way, right? And then eventually any money is too much money, and what you think, how do you define that? But I feel that a healthy fiscal policy, you try to have a bell curve, right? You want a strong middle class. And what you want are policies that pull people from below the poverty line up into the middle of the bell curve. And you want policies that try to push people that are way above it back in a little bit. Right. Now, that doesn't mean they're trying to make everybody poor. It just means that's the way you want to fund it. But to be honest, it goes so much further than just you have to work and you are going to get COVID on the subway. I mean, that's a very valid point, but that's almost just one symptom, right? I mean, it's like talking about a patient with cancer. And it's yeah, dude, they totally have a cough. Yes, that's worth talking about. We need to treat that. But the root cause is, okay, here's one. So all these schools in SF have been closed, right? For the whole year. Okay. And I can't remember the numbers. I think the Times recently had a pretty interesting op-ed that was kind of covering this. It was something about why California makes progressives nervous or something like that. But it had a couple of really interesting facts that I think are really pertinent to where my head goes, which is, hey, I think it's something over half the students in SF are white, right? And yet, when you look at public schools, it's only 17 or 15% enrollment that are white. So all the kids of color go to the public schools. Well, the public schools have been closed for a year. The private schools, though, which service all the other kids, a lot of those have been open, right? So now you already have a wealth gap. And now you've got a year where these other kids just need to learn on Zoom what they can. And then these more privileged kids are getting handheld. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not resenting the people that are going to private school. If you have the money and you want to send your kid for an education, more power to you, right? This isn't about that. What this is about is hosing the people that are going to public school, right? And instead of trying to deal with this issue, the school board recently just passed, I think it was 5-1 or 6-1. It was almost unanimous. They passed this thing where they're going to rename 40 or 50 schools in the Bay. Right? because some of the names, like, you know, Abraham Lincoln, they've decided to racist names, and it's like this is the focus, and I'm like, oh my god, like, again, I don't really care about the names of the schools. It's not like there aren't a billion schools in this country named Abraham Lincoln. Like, if you don't want to have your school name that, fine. I find it mind-boggling. It's like watching pick like paint samples or like polishing the silverware. It's didn't know what to say to some of this stuff, and the gap just keeps getting bigger, you know. And instead of really addressing the core issues, you just see these wealthy people kind of throw a few dollars at the issue, decide that that's bought them forgiveness for whatever wealth discrepancy exists, and then they can kind of put up a billboard talking about how progressive they are or woke or whatever you want to call it, and then you know, if you're poor, man, you're hosed. I mean, like, it's mind-boggling, like, to watch this. So
you're a parent now. What do you look for in the future for your child as they get older and getting into the school system, but just life in general? What are your biggest takeaways from the situation that you're living in now? And then also, what's your biggest fear moving forward for your kids?
I have two biggest fears. I mean, obviously, there's the fears any parent has. So, I mean, I won't get into those because that's just, you know, the standard things. You know, when you have happy, healthy kids and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But like, when I look at the situation, I have two fears, because I feel like what's being offered in this country is a complete false choice. I feel like you're either almost dysfunctionally woke, right, where you have to look at everything through this lens of, you know, race and history, or even like kind of a victim narrative. And that doesn't mean that people aren't victims. I want to be very clear. But like, there's a certain point at which things just aren't constructive, right? Where it's like you do have to figure out a way forward. And I feel like that's one choice. I'm very worried about, you know, my kid taking up those values because I don't agree with them. Now, that doesn't mean I'm worried about them having an awareness of all these issues. In fact, I hope they do. But I just want to make sure that they have this ultimate faith that, like, you know, you can do things or you can overcome. Like, this is very important to me. And then and then also there's this other fear that I have where you can go kind of the other direction and create, you know, your own little version of a trust fund baby, right? Where it's like, okay, well, I'll shield you from a lot of this thinking that's taken over our public schools, or I'll shield you from this. But when you bunker down, so to speak, the people you're in the bunker with have some pretty interesting viewpoints as well that are, I think, not something I want my kids to pick up either. I mean, I feel like it's a real balance. It's it's one of the reasons I like Oakland. I mean, I feel like, you know, you've got the Bay, and a lot of the politics, but, you know, when you get in the car with a Lyft driver around here, or when you go, you know, talk to people, like, people around here typically have pretty real problems, and they're just trying to get through the day. And they might have a progressive worldview, but it's kind of imbued over, you know, the reality of trying to get through the day, getting along with everybody. I mean, it's pretty mixed. I mean, you know, it functions well. And I say it functions well because the individuals function well, but the policies, it's kind of like the individuals function well in the city in spite of the policies, not because of them.
Yeah.
You know?
Do you think that social mobility will exist in the same facet as it did for us? I mean, we're in our 40s. I think we were just right time, right place with the internet and with a lot of other changes that were happening when we were coming of age, that we were either able to jump onto or able to utilize to get ahead, whether it's within business, within tech, what have you. Do you think those same opportunities for the average person growing up will exist in that same facet for, like, your kids?
That's a tough one. I think the answer is a very split answer. And my answer is going to be yes,
give me the best case scenario, and then like doomsday kind of, what would you think the worst could happen?
Honestly, I think actually you're going to get a best case and a doomsday. I honestly think the answer is both. Ironically, I mean, here's what it is. I think yes, but unlike it was for our generation, where I mean, I want to acknowledge some people just got hosed, but in general, there was some real opportunity out there if you wanted to lean in.
Right.
I feel that the way it's going to work for the next generation is there will be immense opportunity if you are positioned correctly. If you are not, like if you're not put on the right place on the chessboard, you're in big trouble.
Right.
And I think it's because, as you alluded to with the caste system, I mean, what you're going to have are groups of kids that have like the global skill sets. They've been given that education. They will have that, why don't we call it the typical like American entrepreneurialism. And I think those kids in this next world, or like this next generation, are going to crush it. I mean, I think these are going to be the people that are going to, and I don't necessarily mean in a aggressive, mean way, but it could even just be like, if you look at it, trade as a little bit of a game, right? These are the people that are going to go toe to toe with China in the next generation and see what we can do. And a lot of them are first generation immigrants. I mean, this is actually really exciting, I think. But I think if you aren't given the right skills, we're entering an era where there's table stakes now. Like this idea that you can just show up without basic knowledge, I mean, that's starting to really wane. And I think part of that's America, but part of it's also just our position in the world. I mean, we haven't really reconciled the fact that like the post-World War II, Cold War paradigm, America as a leader dominating globally, that chapter is ending, and that chapter is going, I don't know what moment, I don't know exactly what form it will take. I mean, that's not necessarily a war or something, but there's going to be a moment where everyone's going to realize that the US can't do what it was able to do even 30 years ago. And I just mean that as in, look, China is a powerful country with a lot of people. Asia is its backyard. Our ability to project power and to influence Asian politics is going to depend a lot more on our allies in the region. We're not just going to be able to show up the way we used to and kind of say, well, America says, and everybody has to kind of do it. Same with Europe. I mean, we can't be ready for a war with Russia at all times just because, Germany doesn't want to buy some tanks. Like at a certain point, there's going to be, I'll call it like the oh shit moment, right? Where something will happen and the old school system would have been, well, America or Europe or these traditional, I'm going to call them traditional just because the last 50 years they've dominated politics, right? But
yeah,
traditionally powerful countries will step in and somehow, quote unquote, fix it. And it's just, I'm not saying they won't at all, right? But it will be notably reduced and there will have to be more of a partnership. And I don't think it's anything as extreme as this, so I don't want to paint a bleak picture, but I imagine it's a lightweight version of what Britain went through in the 50s, right? Where it's all of a sudden, it's like everything doesn't fall apart overnight, but it's just like, yeah, but you're not the British Empire anymore, right? And there's other players, and you now have to manage things in a different way. Now, doesn't mean it's awful being British, right? It just means you don't have these like endless pools of opportunity that are just given to the citizens,
right?
Because you control world politics, right? Because I don't think that's going to happen. That's not how this is going to look in 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. And then just to jump along that notion, I think the world is better when there isn't a hegemony, when we have more of an oligopoly kind of style, in the same way that we were talking about with politics, right? In that sense, right? We need to have different ideas to fight it out, right? In a weird way, I look at ideas as never having agency, and they're constantly changing and forming, right? In a sense of, think about a Japanese swordsmith, right? Like a blacksmith who just like bends metal constantly and just banging out, and they've come to find out through forensics that they can tell where a sword came from based on the precision of that, banging out in the blacksmith, doing his thing, right? And so I think that, in a sense, is the same way that we got to look at our country, our ideology, right? Like, we are constantly an amalgamation of new ideas coming from all around the world, trying to get the best and brightest to be educated by us, and hopefully we get to a point where we can actually, and that's one of the, I think, failed policies of the United States, is educating the best and the brightest around the planet and not allowing them to stay to reap the benefits of the education that we've provided them. And I don't want it to be like some of the, let's say, for example, with the tech companies and holding those B visas and things like that, where, for example, they're software engineers, but they're getting paid half as much, but that's a lot more money than they would get back home per se. And so they think it's a great deal. They're kind of being, utilized as a indentured servitude of labor of some sort. And everybody feels like they're winning in that sense. I don't want that either. So we got to figure out a little bit better momentum to bring people into the fold in that capacity, like moving forward. But I think that's what separates the United States. And I would say I'm more of a realist and an optimist at this point in time in life in general, but still optimistic in a sense that all governments, all systems around the world are having problems right now. Obviously, it's needless to say, right? But the ones that have the influx of ideas coming in and the people willing to roll up their sleeves and serve the people more than their own, their own issues and their own, that's where it's at. And I think America still has that when we're getting into like what I feel is a Renaissance period in that, where we're getting people that normally maybe wouldn't have jumped into the realm of public service, and they just feel indebted to the country based on where they are. And I think those values are eventually kind of come back and come full circle again, where we don't have aristocracy in the United States, but we do have, and a defining public that, our elites, it's very fluid and it's not based on titles, but those people are going to come back into the fold and have to prove their worth, because in any other system around the world, they wouldn't have been in the situation they are today if it were not for the rules, the way they're played here in the United States,
And to clarify kind of what I was saying earlier, I think we're on a trajectory for what I was describing. I actually think this could totally be another American century. this is something where if we play our cards right, we're well positioned for a lot of amazing things, right? But definitely we need to like lean in and make it happen, right? And I feel that, I don't know, this is going to get a little meta, but I feel that the problem we have right now is within a society, liberalism and conservatism both serve a function, right? Like it's a very important balance. Like if you think of, I don't know, being a society like surfing, right? You don't want to go one way or the other too much, or you just wipe out.
Yeah.
And you can argue about whether it's better to wipe out forward or backwards, but I think at that point you're getting into semantics, right? It's just like, hey, this is a thing. And I don't know, obviously I have a bit of a specific lens because of where I live. And so I'm seeing some of the pathology that's really entered the left of the way of thinking that's like there's some real problems. Like, what is it? They did a survey of SF, like a couple of years ago. And they checked out like 150 or 155 city blocks or something like that. And they were looking for just like cleanliness. And it was like 91 of the blocks out of 150 had feces, right? I think they found like, I can't remember the number. I want to say it was around 100 needles. It was like, and the studies were like, this is dirtier than like some of the worst neighborhoods in like the third world, right? And this is right out in front of these tech companies. And so to your point, we have all this money being generated, but is it helping? And then around here, the narrative is, well, we don't want to, and on one hand, I think this is good, right? You don't want to be like, well, let's just round up the homeless people or something overly aggressive. A lot of these people have problems. They need some serious help. But like, on the other hand, it's like, is it even benefiting the homeless people to live in these conditions? Like, never mind everybody else, right? It's like, when I take Cyrus to the park and I have to watch for needles everywhere, or, friggin' condoms or beer cans. And if you say anything, you're considered, not not in line, let's just say, right? You're questioning the, like, well, what do you want to have happen to the homeless people? And it's kind of like, well, how come there's not a middle ground, right? Like, how come not wanting needles in your park is equated with, you know, throwing homeless people in jail? Like, that's an obvious leap, right? And clearly something needs to be offered that's different. And so I feel that the meta problem in this country is, and this is again just watching the kind of pathology that's going on, is, you know, you look at BLM, and I'm not going to get into the details of the movement. And by the way, I'm not trying to equate this to a pathology at all, but it's just, you know, of course they're angry because you still have part of the country that when people say Black Lives Matter, they're still kind of like hesitant. Like, like it's like, hey, maybe you don't have to agree with the whole movement, but there are literally people that are like, well, and I'm like, at a certain point, they just do. It's like if I said, you know, kids shouldn't be shot.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be like, well, neither should these people. It's like, that's a weird answer, right? It's just a weird answer. Now, that doesn't mean these other issues, like, I mean, look, I'm actually not against the police. Like, I don't have any issue with them. I think they're
Right.
very valuable, right?
Like, why can't you be for both? Why do you have to just take one stand or another? Is it the point? I think
I agree.
that sucks.
I agree. I think what's happening is, though, because I've been thinking about this a lot. I think that there's like it'll drive you crazy, right? If you were arguing with someone and they're kind of hesitant to acknowledge the fact that, like, your life matters, or that there's an issue that you're experiencing, and it makes you nuts, right? Like, that's how people normally respond. Like, and I'm not trying to say that they're nuts, but it makes you off kilter. And so you see these different movements that have a real core point. It's almost like they're being trolled, and so they go kind of in this like spin-off. And for me, I feel that the failure in a lot of ways at this point is actually on the conservative side, where, like, look, to go back to my point about having to go, you know, like, into the future, right? Having liberalism and conservatism, like, both have a function. If you think about conservatism as defining today in a healthy way, and liberalism is supposed to define tomorrow, there's this massive failure right now on the conservative side to define today in any sort of a sane way.
Right.
So it's kind of like if you have a really bad launch pad, of course the rocket ship is doing weird things because it's responding to, I mean, like, what is America today, right? I mean, you know, like, you've talked about these, like, you know, the workers that they brought in on the visas and all this, but, like, is that America? Like, are we literally just like a large corporate entity that somehow benefits us? We all somehow are stockholders and we're really just arguing about stock shares? Like, if that's the case, like, we have a massive problem.
Right.
I mean, like, it baffles me still that, like, the Conservative Party isn't more pro-immigrant. I mean, I hear their viewpoints all the time about, you know, the values, you know, that the country should espouse. And I'm like, you know, yeah, it's the guy from Mexico roofing your house that has those values.
Yeah.
Like, how do you not see that? And I'm still struggling with the way to word this, but when you're dealing with that type of mentality that's just so off, then what happens is, of course, these organizations are then also off, because if you're arguing with a crazy man, you go crazy. Like, that's just one of those things, right? So to me, conservatives define the situation we're in today. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with everything. It doesn't mean you think everything's hunky-dory. It just means, like, we're not defining a healthy, what is the country about, right? And
I would almost counter that. I would say that you are correct in that liberals push for the future, but the problem that we have is nobody's in the present, and that we have bifurcated our thought process, whereas conservatives tend to view things in nostalgia and the euphoria of yesteryear and how things were, right? That's why slogans like "Make America Great Again" were so resonant to that particular demographic, was because they're thinking about the good times that they had, where if you put in a good hard day's work and things like that, there was definitely more of a meritocracy in society. I can understand why they would want that, right? And at the same token, I can understand from a liberal mindset on, like, we understand where you're coming from, but we still have work to do. Like, this is a perpetual cycle of equal opportunity inclusion, and we haven't hit the threshold on that or have come even close. And so we have to progressively think about new ideas of inclusion to allow equal opportunity without diminishing equality of outcome. And with that, that's where the disconnect, I think, is. And there's nobody sitting at the middle of the table anymore because we've kind of turned it into almost, like war game theory in a sense, where whoever quits first is going to lose. And so everybody's digging their heels in on their ideology without coming to the table and breaking bread as before. Right. And you're kind of like, let's figure this out. I think there's more people in line in the middle, left or right, center, than there are in these fringe groups that are actually in control of some facet, right? When you look at, let's say, for example, like the DNC, right? In a sense of any one of these progressives, like the Congresswoman Porter from Irvine, California, has been taken off the financial committee, oversight committee, because she was kind of too good at her job. She was actually asking and grilling people from the corporate world, why is it that you're paying the minimum wage, for example, for a bank teller of some kind? She was asking Jamie Dimon, he's like, but she's negative $500 at the end of the day for what the average cost of living is for that particular area. You guys have the studies and all the material for that. Why is it that you can't add to that? And so those people, though, I guess my point is that those people are being ostracized from the power brokers and the cabal that exists on both sides of the aisle, per se. And anybody with new ideas gets their heads whacked down like a whack-a-mole scenario. And it sucks because those people are, I think, important to the progression of our society. And I think that the powers that be, in a sense of like the people that are still in power, you have Nancy Pelosi, you have Feinstein, you have a lot of these people that are our grandparents' age that are still working. And I think that in itself is a little bit ludicrous because not only of the cognitive, abilities that are declining per se for doing the job. And that's very obviously dependent on the person and what have you. But the simple fact is they're not allowing other people to take control of the country. And so when these people aren't retiring when they should be, now you've basically pushed down everybody else that was behind you that believes in institutions, that wants to do something in that sense, and they end up going somewhere else because you're holding on to that position that much longer. And so that's kind of the scenario that we have right now. And not only that, but then being overqualified for an average job, like just to get the particular position that you need to get in the door, you have to have like 3 levels of extra certification to get that going.
Well, we're not equipping the next generation well, right? We're selling them stuff. We're like, oh, you need this 4-year college, whether they need it or not. What they're being taught in there maybe not even be the right things they need for a career, right? I mean, here's the thing, and this is where, because my leanings tend to be a little more conservative, I'm going to be a little bit harsh on the conservatives here because I feel that the progressives are trying to move forward. I don't agree with a lot of what they're doing, but it's like this instinct, like they know something's wrong, so they're kind of flailing about. And some of the things they're hitting on are, I think, correct, but I think cohesively as a policy, I think it was Ibram Kendi in the book How to Be an Anti-Racist brings up a good point about how, like, look, it's not about policy, like it's about policy outcomes. It's not about how you feel, right? And I feel like what's happened in the Bay is it's become about how you feel, and that makes sense because they want to feel good because there's not a healthy narrative. I mean, it's confusing to me when I think of a lot of the values that I hear a lot of my, compatriots talk about that identify as conservative. And it's like, look, man, okay, let's use BLM as an example. You have a group of people that have essentially, they've just gotten the short end of the stick. And that's obviously a very nice euphemism for all the terrible things that have happened for 400 years, right? And now clearly there's a problem still. Like you can argue about what that problem is, the details. You can argue about like, well, I like this protest or I don't, whatever. you're out of your mind if you're not acknowledging the fact that there's some sort of serious issue here still that needs to be dealt with. And to me, if I was going down the road and I saw somebody with a flat tire, right, I try to help them. I wouldn't necessarily be like, well, I didn't make the tire flat. And I feel like we're in this argument about whether or not, as an individual or as a group, we made the tire flat. And I'm like, it's a red herring, right? Because it shouldn't, pardon my French here, but it shouldn't fucking matter, right? It's like, are you arguing that these people aren't suffering and that you don't want to try to help? And what I feel has happened in the Bay, and this is where I'm going to turn my criticism on the Bay a little bit, is I feel that there's been this religion, if you will, created. It reminds me a little bit of like Catholicism in the Middle Ages, where there's like indulgences and whatnot. And basically it's like, look, you pay these crazy high taxes, right? Like through the roof taxes, but don't ask any questions. Mm-hmm. Don't ask why the homeless people are still living in shit on the street. Don't ask why we can't get them a sandwich. Don't ask that. Because that's like asking where the money went when you gave it to the church, right? You've bought your forgiveness. You need to just be happy. Make sure you repeat these lines. And as long as you say these prayers, right, and give the money to the church, your sins are absolved. But God help you if you ask a question about why you're not really helping the poor. Like, why are there so many poor and the bishop is living in a fucking gilded castle? Don't ask that question, right? And I don't understand why conservatives have become so hung up on becoming this party of, 20-year wars in the Middle East. Like, green energy is a security thing, right? Like, okay, fine. You don't believe in global warming. Okay. I think Schwarzenegger put a really good case forward for like why you should be pro green energy, even if you don't believe in global warming. Like, you don't even need that. Right. The analogy I use with people out here is like, it's like arguing, the house is on fire and you're going to argue about whether or not the couch is on fire. And it's like, you don't need that, right? Like, there's an island the size of, I think it's like the size of Texas in the Pacific of plastic. Like, the oceans are 90% fished out. Mm-hmm. California is on fire. I woke up one day, it looked like Blade Runner on my window, orange clouds, and you had to run HEPA filters just so the kids weren't coughing, right? It's crazy. And like, why is it that my choices are either some sort of hyper progressive philosophy that I don't believe will fix things because it's super not practical, or what? I'm okay with everything as it is because you shouldn't be okay with things as they are.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I also don't understand why wanting change has become this like un-American thing. Now, I disagree with some of the change that's out there, but like a lot of these people are hurting. Also, they're bringing up good friggin' points. And if you want to engage with them, you shouldn't just shut them down. To your point, like, when I can't remember her name, but you were saying, she was maybe too good at her job. It's like,
Congressman Porter.
Want. Yeah. Because really what this is, man, is this is the super rich people just like protecting themselves, and somehow they've gotten like the left to be, I think, slightly dysfunctional, and then they've gotten the right to become like their personal bodyguards, but it doesn't benefit everybody. Like, this isn't, and I'm not even saying these people have to be, let's go for these people. It's more just like, hey, there's a focus here that's completely off base from these issues. And I think in the future, if you don't get a good education, or you're left being one of these poor people that are left behind, like, I think it's gonna be a rough ride, man, especially with globalization.
Yeah. And I think our upbringing is different. And obviously, for those that don't know, both of our parents were in the military. And so we got to travel and kind of see the world in a different way, and then eventually move back to the United States. With that, I think it opens your mind to being more receptive to ideas and different ways of life that generally aren't your own. And that comes not even from just the surroundings that you have in the environment. Obviously, I'm talking about like growing up in Germany, for example, but also on the base. Like, there's maybe a sense of difference in between some of maybe the officers and some of the enlisted folks, but at the end, all the kids go to the same school. All the people are living and shopping at the same grocery stores and have something in common and have a common understanding of the lifestyle that we've chosen. For some reason, America doesn't have that same semblance of order, in a sense of collective idea in what we're doing, you know. And it's sad in some ways, because we grew up in a different time where, and I think even we were sheltered in some ways to grow up in some kind of like multicultural, you know, kind of little petri dish of society in that way. And then when we got to the States, it wasn't the way we grew up. And I think for me anyway, like coming back, I don't know how it was for you going to school in Austin, but it was definitely I had to shift my mindset in a sense of like, this is really what America's like. I had to like do a lot of trial and error with that, but in a sense of who I am as a person and what I value, I don't think has changed too much, but I have to, in some ways, you have to play the game to succeed, right? You have to get into the institutions that are going to help you progress in society. And there's obviously, we both have along the way, and I respect you immensely, you know, in a sense of having to eat crow, you know, along the way, like to go, like, for example, to school for architecture for 5 years and then having to work under somebody for another 3. I mean, a lot of people probably don't know that. And then, you know, with the 2008 crash, you know, like architecture went by the wayside, and you just made do what you could, right? Like whatever job you could take. I mean, yeah, you could have like rested on your laurels and said, you know what, I'm not going to take a job that doesn't pay me, you know, at least as much as what I was making as an apprenticeship underneath somebody else. But you didn't do that. And I think the same was for me. Like when I got out of the military, it was like, I'm going to do this. And then, you know, eating crow on that stupid food truck and what have you, you know, like you just learn to adapt, you make things go as you can, and then keep going with that. And I don't know if those, like you were talking about, those values are being instilled in our next generation in the same capacity.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's this idea, like, it's like, okay, we'll bleakly reference the food truck here. It's like, look, that's something that was a concept that would add value, right? It's this idea that like, hey, people would enjoy these donors, right? Like this is something that they would enjoy doing. Or with me, it's like, hey man, architecture is a little bit rough right now. And I was like, well, maybe I'll get back in, but you know, hey, you know, you got to do what you got to do. And also, you know, there's a lot of opportunity out there. So you just kind of jump in. And I was actually very grateful because I was, through all the financial crisis, able to remain employed. I was able to help some other friends of mine. You know what I mean? Like, like that to me actually has a real value, right? Like to be able to kind of work through things together. And I think to kind of really thread what I was talking about earlier with some of these views is I feel like what's happening is there's a conflating of statements or problems which are very real and need to be acknowledged and talked about in a pretty harsh way, because we need to really resolve some of these things. With the idea that there isn't like this better tomorrow, right? Or it's almost unachievable, or it's only possible through some sort of like, you know, extreme like smashing of every single thing and all the values. It becomes to me a very baby with the bathwater type of a problem, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like America is, I guess it's like if you're playing blackjack, right? And you've got like a 16 or a 17, like, hey man, that's pretty good. You could do worse. And, you know, you've got one side being like, this is fine because they're taken care of. And the other side that's less taken care of is just like, hit me. And you're like, okay, but we got to be a little careful here, right? Because we need to make sure that we actually get the change that we want, right? My biggest worry is that we get change just because I think we're at a point in history, it's an inflection point. I think there will be change. I think there's going to be a huge change in the next 10 years. And the question to me is like, what change? And my worry is that the conservatives, by refusing to engage with this concept that we need to define today so that we can create the proper change, right, as a country, because we need to. There's no doubt, right? This whole idea of like rewinding to the 50s, ignoring the fact that a lot of people don't like the 50s, didn't have a good experience. Like it's just not where we should be. Like this isn't a post-World War II thing, right? Like we need to adapt. America adapts. We can do this. But we need to understand, like, you know, when Kaepernick kneels, You don't have to agree with him, but you need to try to go like, why is he doing that? Right? And instead, what we've been doing right now is we're othering. We're all othering each other. And the problem with that is it takes you down this path where at that point, things become insurmountable because we can only do this together. It's kind of ironic. What is it? The prisoner's dilemma? It's almost like, I guess that's a terrible analogy, but it's kind of true. It's like, in a way, America's become like the prisoner's dilemma, where like we can all vote to help each other and then things are going to be great, or not, in which case maybe one or two groups finds the following change to be okay, but it's Yahtzee who those groups are. And I don't know if it's going to make a lot of people happy. So I'm inclined to say, what do we do to try to help those suffering, create a strong middle class, and really go with what I think is the most American of traits, which is like this dream that we could have a better tomorrow if we just somehow lean in, instead of just like, I don't know, like solve the of the wall or something ridiculous.
What did you think of the whole GameStop issue last month?
Yeah, it's that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about with the pathology. Like, I have to be careful, I guess, with that word, because I'm not trying to imply that these things are like diseases. It's just more like, yeah, we've created a wacky environment where hedge funds have been messing with people for 20 years now. And at some point the people mess back. And of course, that's not necessarily constructive, right? I mean, it can destabilize the market, can cause all sorts of issues. People can lose their money if they don't know what they're doing. I mean, this can get pretty serious. On the other hand, I don't know, you poke people enough and you get poked back. I mean, that's kind of how the world works.
Yeah, sorry about that. We had a little break in our time here, but we were just discussing, the President Trump's impact on the country, in a sense of him kind of showing the country how the system works. And unveiling some of that, it's less magical in a sense. I think, as far as what people perceived it to be, is some of the honor and the prestige of the positions and the institutions that we hold dear are just mechanisms for, let's just say, a cabal of oligopolies and corporatocracy, behind the scenes, that is vying for power and control, and they're not going to give it up at any point in time until they absolutely have to. And we've seen that time and time again with the elected officials who are in positions of influence. Let's say some of these progressives that are coming into the fold. But then when they get into their caucus, they don't have the capacity to affect change because they get drowned out by the caucus elites, such as, Speaker Pelosi, things of that nature. And so we were just discussing that that realism of Trump kind of unveiling some of the inner workings and the processes of DC. Do you think that he actually drained the swamp, or do you think he actually enhanced it and people kind of hunkered down even more and doubled down on what they normally do?
I feel like honestly, I do think he drained parts of it. I think the challenge about Trump is, regardless for a moment of how you feel about his policies, because before we had the interruption, you were talking about how the office of the president has lost some of its prestige, or kind of like the man behind the curtain has been shown, kind of a thing. And I think definitely there's some of that, but I also think it's also shown the nature of the position. I think a lot of times people have thought about the position as this purely power position, right? Where you can just kind of wave a wand, and there's executive orders. I mean, there's definitely power, but to me, the real power of the presidency is that they get to set the tone. And the thing that Trump did, again, ignoring policy for a minute, is that he turned up the volume, he turned up the heat, right? And on one hand, I mean, kind of like with COVID, right? It's kind of forced us into this space where hey, the economic divide has gotten greater, right? Look, the corporations are getting bailed out, small businesses are still struggling. this heat, I think, that he brought to the table, it's been a long time coming, right? This isn't something that's new that just he did. I mean, he was an agent of it, but he didn't create it. And I feel that that's really where the president has a lot of control. And I think that this is where it's a bit defining, because the question is this: do we need the heat higher so that we can kind of bring these issues to a crescendo one way or another, right? And be like, okay, because we clearly have things we need to resolve. Or to kind of what I was getting at earlier, is this the prisoner's dilemma where, everybody's got some grievances, but we need to figure out a way to get along in order to go forward, right? And it's I don't know, right? I mean, on one hand, I feel like there's definitely some battles that need to be fought. On the other hand, I'm going to ignore Twitter for a minute, because I think a lot of the loudest voices on Twitter are just very divisive. When I'm at talking to people, even if I don't agree with them about a lot of stuff, we're all trying to address the same things. I mean, it's one of the reasons Bernie Sanders was such a hot candidate back when Hillary was running against Trump, was, he was talking about the things that are on people's mind, right? So even if you don't agree with his like socialism standpoints, it's kind of where Trump got some of his early, speed, was just this idea that like people don't feel like the government represents them. So for better or for worse, he's kind of like, well, I'll try to fix that. There's large swaths of the country that feel ignored. And this is where I feel like really both parties are dropping the ball. Is I feel like your average American just feels like the government isn't doing anything to help them, or at least not much, right? And so you just have this kind of zeitgeist of angst and frustration. And that's dangerous, because it allows, the strong man, so to speak, or, strong woman, today's age, right? To step in and to potentially misuse that. But it's also a potential real agent of change, where it's like, hey, there's a lot of issues that have been building up like underbrush in the woods. At a certain point, you do need to kind of clear these things up. I mean, like, for example, a lot of discussions have been made about student loan debt. And I think this is actually a very existential question, right? I mean, well, if you pay the debt, then that frees up a lot of the economy. I mean, we kind of need to do this. Like, straddling a young generation with a ton of debt isn't constructive, right? Ignoring morality about, well, you signed the dotted line or whatever we want to say. Like, truth is, we set up a funnel for people to do this. We set the expectations. The jobs really aren't there. This doesn't make sense, and they need help. Having said that, how do you manage a system and create stability when you kind of capriciously decide, well, this debt we're going to cover? I think there was like that famous incident where the father confronted Warren and said, hey, what about me? I used my savings to pay the debt. Are you going to help me? And, this is where I think, and you're actually probably more familiar than I am, but, I look at like the German model and I start to think, well, one thing that they do is they don't say, well, we're going to provide free college unless you're rich. Then we don't, right? It's almost just like, hey, it's provided, or hey, we're going to create these broad benefits that just address the social issues. And I think what that does, that's interesting, that I see lacking in the U.S. system, is it actually creates unity, right? It's almost like you're starting to see this with the COVID checks a little bit, where it's like, hey, we're just going to cut everybody a check, and we know everybody kind of needs the money, and here you go, right? Now there's serious consequences to that. So I'm not speaking about writing the checks to everybody all the time, but these are questions that we don't fundamentally agree on as a country, and we really need to decide, like, what are we about, so that we can decide what we're trying to do here. Because I feel like the paradigms are, and I'm going to be very kind to both sides, I feel like the paradigms are either you've got this idea of like, individual freedom, you have an opportunity, but you have to make your own way. If you fail, well, try not to fail. And then you have this other side that's, well, no, we're all responsible for each other. But because of that, it fundamentally would shift the system and potentially reduce greatly the opportunity potential, right? And I just don't know if the country's on the same page about what we're even trying to do. So it makes it hard to argue about who's right.
No, I definitely see that point. To go on what you were talking about with the German model, I think there's some realistic expectations in that model, and the fact, well, things are changing though too there. So the apprenticeship programs, like you and I both know, we've been in construction or something in that nature, like either directly or indirectly for a while, right? Here or there.
Yeah.
So like I have a project coming up, and the labor force in that skilled labor, they can't find enough plumbers. They can't find enough dudes that have those particular skill sets. And we've really had to go to essentially to other people in other countries, even if they are not here documented, for example, to get a lot of that stuff done, right? And so are we as a society shooting ourselves in the foot by not training up these people that we know damn well could do the job, but we also know that it's very labor intensive at the same time, right? And they wouldn't put up with the hazardous working conditions that some of these guys sometimes having to face, whether it be, environmental conditions or safety or what have you, right? Like they have the ability to say something, whereas the other people that might not be in that position to be an American, for example, and have the fear of relying and sending money back home, things of that nature. They have a different outlook on what is acceptable behavior, as far as labor and management are concerned. In Germany, they still export a lot of things, but now they've kind of gone, from what I've seen anyway, just from my personal experience, they've kind of gone the American route, where China and Germany are the biggest trading partners with each other. And so with that, obviously, automobiles, appliances, things like that from Germany go to China. But then the other things are that normally were produced back in the day in Germany are now being produced in China. So everything is changing, and it's constantly in flux in that sense. And you see, I think the German model works well when you are building a manufacturing base strictly for exporting the products that you're designing and building to the outside world. And that really propelled Germany to be the economy it is today. But I don't think that model is sustainable if you try to change that model into the U.S. model, because of the framework on the mentality of the labor force, who are entrusting the government to put them in the right places to succeed. So, for example, your university example, you get there based on merit or connections, right? And so the smartest and the most connected get to go. The people, in Germany, they don't let the Sally who got C's go to college per se, because the investment's not there for the country. They look at it as like a personal investment into the country, and if we let the best and brightest go, then hopefully through the education, but then also through the camaraderie amongst your classmates, maybe you'll even get better at your craft and whatever you're learning and what have you, right? And that's a benefit to society as a whole. I actually believe that as well. The problem in the United States is, if universities were held accountable, not only selecting people based on the grades that were being provided in their essays and all that stuff, but also on the merit of if they were able to pay back the money that they had to pay and it didn't go through the banks as guaranteed loans, then they would look at things a lot differently, in a sense of like, I don't know if this person is, they have the aptitude to be here, but I'm not sure they can cut it as far as paying us back, in a sense, right? Because if I like, for example, if you and I are doing something and I give you a guaranteed loan, like, you could care less if it fails or not. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's the problem we have in the States. If we treat education debt the same way we treat any other debt, things would get interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, this goes back to the, I can't remember the name of the program, but the one after World War II, right? With the GI Bills and all that. Like, where, the idea was we're going to create a more educated workforce and give them more, non-physical jobs and more white-collar jobs. That as we talked about earlier with some of the pathologization of things, like it, it's morphed. And what we've done instead is we've convinced people, if you don't have a white collar job, then you don't really have a job. And you're supposed to do this four-year college. And I think we set people up in two ways to kind of force the four-year college. So one of the ways that we force the four-year college is our high schools aren't very good. So what you need is a college degree just to prove that you actually know how to read an essay, or that you've read some like philosophy books, right? I mean, I'm being a little sarcastic here, but coming out of the American high school education system, if I'm interviewing you, I don't necessarily know if you know how to like write a letter. I mean, I'm not being sarcastic, right? Like these schools, some of them are pretty bad. And so it's almost like, well, now you have to go to university just to show me that you actually have the equivalent of a high school education on a certain level. And then you have to pay for it, right? You get all these English 101 classes and things that I would argue in much of the first world are taught in high school. So you're not requiring these universities to do it, so they can focus more on that. And then the second is this idea that somehow trade jobs are lesser. I laugh because in a way coding is somewhat of a blue collar job. I mean, I know by definition it's white collar because you're in a computer and you're in a room, you're not working with your hands, but it feels very much like a physical job because you're given these assignments, move the data, do this. I mean, it's that kind of work. And it's interesting because I went to this boot camp and they advertised it this way. I have everything to believe about that. My own experience has been like this, but you go to this boot camp for 3 months and you get out and literally you are on average paid more than a Stanford CS grad. I mean, think about that, right? I mean, I can't remember the exact amount we paid, but let's say 25 or 30,000 bucks versus what, a 4-year degree, you're earning no income. How much is housing and education? Now, we need people with CS degrees, so I'm not trying to belittle that. But you need that degree if you're doing certain very advanced things. If you're just building some programs, I mean, and I say that colloquially, but even at a high level, you don't necessarily need 4 years of chipset theory, right? And somehow we've sold this bill of goods, and we've also linked it into this rite of passage, almost well, you don't want to miss out on these 4 years of college, which I'll have to admit, I mean, I had a good time, so I don't want to downplay that. But it's this idea that you can't just jump in there and make some money, and somehow that's been looked down upon. And it's crazy because it would solve a huge amount of our problems, because to your point, there are so many companies that are looking for machinists, repair people, and these jobs pay 6 figures. I mean, this isn't something where it's oh gee whiz, this is better than being a waiter. This is something that's significant. I mean, what is it, Mike Rowe covers this topic a lot, in a lot of very dynamic ways. And that's the kind of thinking I think we need, right? How can we beef up our community college so that people just aren't being straddled with this debt in the first place? And then it's well, you know what? Look, man, if you want to take on $500,000 worth of debt to be a doctor, okay, then you're going to have the debt. But I think a big part of the problem we have right now, morally, is that we're setting people up with this, unless you're very out of the box thinking, we kind of set you up for a paradigm where you just assume you have to go, and it's just picking your major. And so it's almost like this debt becomes a default for a lot of people. And I think when you expect people to somehow magically rise above the funnel that society creates, I mean, people rise and fall with their circumstances. I think that's a paraphrase of Thucydides, but he said that in 300 BC, and it's still true to this day, right? If you put things in the wrong context, people are going to behave that way. And sure, you might have some outliers that think it through and can escape it, but we are setting up a system where people are expected to go to college. We won't even look at people's resumes half the time at different jobs I've been at, unless they have a degree, because why not? The other candidates all have.
Yeah.
I don't know. Offered by the other 10 candidates to learn at you. And that's a good position, especially when these things have these crazy price tags.
Yeah, and I think, and this is just me obviously seeing how the sausage was made the last 2 years, the brand recognition that you get from Ivy League versus others, these other schools just are going to crumble because they've built out the mechanisms for like expansion on the merit that people are going to continuously go. You know what I mean? And so now you've added another department, and then you've added another like dean of something, you know, like the dean of social science, the dean, you know, whatever. So you're adding more executives into the fold, and you're not adding more of the personnel that are needed to manage some of those new schools and things like that are coming into the fold. And then the simple fact is, you know, like some of these other schools, they're running their endowments like a hedge fund. And so with that being said, so if you went to that school, you are now tied into basically free money, you know, LLPs all day down the street, as you know, in San Francisco there in the Bay Area. You go to any VC, you can go look at the schools that they go to, and everybody has some kind of endowment agreement with an LLP to, you know, their old alma mater. It's just the way it goes. And so it's just perpetual deals back and forth. And I think some of that definitely needs to change as far as that goes. Like Harvard could, in fact, you know, add more seats, add more people to get through their pipeline to go. But why would they do that? Because that would diminish their brand if they had 500 more seats during their, you know.
Yeah, I mean, these aren't populist institutions that are designed to like help the many. But I mean, at that point, I start to say, well, then we're just looking at the wrong institutions for that thing, because even if somehow somebody made them do it, like you said, it would just devalue it anyway, right? Like, so to me, it's just the wrong tool. Look, honestly, I think this is where, you know, the immigrants are going to save us all, right? Is because they're coming here because they get it, right? They understand, hey, there's opportunity. These are the hustlers. Like, you know, the kid raised in suburbia who's been told to go to school and is just going to like do what he's told. Don't get me wrong, that might be a valuable citizen, but that isn't the person I think is going to like really define this country. I mean, when you see those old school pictures of the immigrants in the 20s, like sitting on those I-beams, you know, building the Empire State Building, that's not the kid that's born in suburbia. That's going to be the kid that comes up from Mexico. That's going to be the kid that comes over from China. These are the people that like hunger to be here, and they get it. And a lot of them, I don't think they're fooled by this like college thing. I mean, I think they see the value in what it holds within the system. And I mean, that's good, right? Because you don't want people dismissing college. It's a very useful tool. But this pipeline that we've created is the problem, right? The fact that people want to go to college isn't the problem. The problem is you should want to go to college because it makes sense based on what you're trying to do. Right. Not, I need to like stamp some piece of paper, pay somebody $300,000, and then I'm, you know, stuck behind this debt 8-ball until I'm in my 40s when it doesn't even help me, right? I mean, like, you know, I mean, it's like you mentioned Harvard.
There's both sides of the coin, right, too. You have the education side of it, but then you also have the monetization of self-improvement and small business, right, where you have these quote-unquote gurus that are espousing you to kind of run your own show and this and that, never mind what kind of mental and physical aptitude that these people have as far as like what they can do to run a business, right? They placate and you know, we know the kind where they have these seminars and like these kind of, you know, I wouldn't call them a Ponzi scheme, but they definitely placate to the insecurities of those individuals that show up there. And like, you know, people that don't really have a lot of money, they're paying like $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 for a long weekend seminar to be part of this group to make you feel good. And then they get home and they're kind of like, yeah, rah, rah, rah. And then they don't have that support network or that acumen that either they learn through trial and error, working through under somebody else, like in an apprenticeship program, or through education. And so now they're stuck, right? They've wasted a lot of time and effort. And trial and error is always a good thing. I think we both collectively have done a lot of that in our 20s and even 30s. But at the same time, at some point, you got to understand it. Like, maybe I'm not built for this. Maybe I need
Well,
to figure out that I am, like the self-awareness aspect of it. Like, I think I'm an entrepreneur, but I know that other people aren't. But I also need folks that need to know that they are the best vice president they could be, or whatever. You know what I mean? And that's the difference. And I don't think we're teaching people that.
No, you're right. I mean, okay, I think that there's a few things to unpack there. So first, like when I was alluding to Harvard earlier, what I was getting at was, it's a great example because, okay, let's say you want to go to Harvard because, I don't know, to me there's kind of three reasons, right? One is you just have the money and you want to take the best classes in something you're interested in because you're passionate about the topic. Like, well, you have the money, so there's really no harm in that. So it's just kind of like, great, no problem. If you look at it as, okay, I want to go work in like the financial sector, and this is going to give me the Rolodex and the credibility to do it. And yeah, I'm going to come out with 400,000 in debt, but I'm going to make 400 a year, so whatever. Again, then it's serving a function in your life, right? But let's go to an extreme case. And I don't. This is a bit of an outlier, so I'm not saying, from my knowledge, Harvard's no worse than anybody else when it comes to this stuff. But it's this idea that, okay, well, let's just say I want to be an art teacher. So I go and I decide I'm going to go to Harvard because I'm really good at it and they're the best. And so I get in, but then I become like a middle school art teacher making, I don't know what middle school art teachers make, but like probably not enough to pay back like a Harvard education quickly. Right. And so that person, and I'm not trying to pick on Harvard, but it's just like that example, right, is like that person is the one that I'm more worried about, where it's like, but hey, this isn't actually serving you, right? And this comes back to the whole like built for this narrative, because on one hand there's the, well, hey, you're not built for it, don't do it. But on the other hand, it's also the society that we're building. I mean, we are building a society through the decisions that we make and what we choose to value that doesn't particularly value things that it doesn't perceive as having value. So like, for example, history is not typically valued in our country, right? Like arts aren't typically valued. This is why, a lot of American cities kind of, I think Alan Watts said it, they look like trash kind of strewed along the highway, right? Like we have our priorities. It makes for an efficient system. But if you're not plugged into that efficiency and you take on this kind of debt, it's going to be a problem. And with your built for this comment, I really like that. I think that the other challenge though is that you have to ask yourself this, okay, you and I have lived in Europe, we've traveled the world. I mean, not that America is a bad place to be, right? But like, we don't build a system that particularly is great for you unless you are doing entrepreneurial work or making a pile of money, right? I mean, we don't have a lot of like built-in days off. You lose your job, you can kind of have a lot of healthcare problems quickly, run into bankruptcy. You can slip out of the middle class in this country pretty easily. Yeah. And so I think what happens is you get people thinking, well, if the main advantage of being in America is to be an entrepreneur or to make, I don't know, dollars, right? Of course, people are going to get fixated on that, even if it's not in their personality. And then they're heavily disadvantaged, right? Because they're trying to do something that's like what the system is designed for, but they're not really cut out for it. Now, this is tough because, I mean, there's an efficiency to a system that just favors, how the cards lay. Like it's one of the reasons America's maintained dominance on a lot of platforms. But on the other hand, where's that balance? Like what's best for, the people of America as a whole, while still letting, entrepreneurialism, like, it's like, you don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Right. Right. But on the other hand, I don't know if I want my kid growing up in a world where he feels like he has to work 80 hours a week, or he can't do something he's interested in because he's got to do the thing that makes the money. Right. So I don't know.
So what is your take on some form of UBI?
I think they should test it. My theory about UBI, I was fascinated. I've been paying a lot of attention. Bringing this one up, and really interesting conversations on some of his podcasts, just watching those when he's being interviewed by people. But so I feel that capitalism and communism, just to paint with a very broad brush, were designed for a world where there's 12 people and there's 7 loaves of bread, you divide it up, right? Like, what do you do? And so capitalism is a pretty good system for that, because you can say, well, okay, we're all going to work, and then based on the value we determine of the work as a group, we just kind of get more bread or less bread. I mean, we're entering an age where, I mean, and I'm not being sarcastic when I say this, like, robots can start to grow your food in the next 10 or 20 years here, and solar panels can power the robots, and robots can build your houses. Like, at a certain point, why would you not make sure that everybody has a roof over their head and a sandwich? I'm using, sandwich for like food, right? Like, yeah. Because there's no moral argument to be made, right? There isn't 7 loaves of bread for 12 people. There's 12 loaves of bread for 12 people. So I think the way the system would go is you come up with some sort of UBI, but you need to be very careful, because our current system is not designed for that. And I think it will have some serious economic consequences, and you have to figure out what those are, right? Like, we have to retool the system to accommodate a flow of cash to people at the bottom, because modern technology allows wealthy people to concentrate wealth so quickly that the problem we're going to be facing, I think, for the next 50 years is, even if you level set tomorrow, snap your fingers, wealth is evenly distributed to everybody, great. The same people are going to have the money in 10 years. I mean,
right.
It's like they're the ones that get it. They're the ones that know how to move the cash. Like, that's what's going to happen.
Do you feel there's going to be a Teddy Roosevelt-like character in the next 10, 20 years that comes about, that is going to be from that upper tier of society that kind of is a traitor to their class for the betterment of America? Or do you think that's far-fetched notion, that just the way we've seen life go, that's just not going to happen? That was kind of an anomaly when it did happen.
No, I think we will. I mean, I think that here's the thing: a lot of people that are wealthy, they know that even if they lose some of their wealth, they're still wealthy, right? It's not like a. I think it's a danger to even other the rich. Like, I try not to picture them all like Smeagol, right, where they're like my pile of cash. A lot of these people have just worked hard for their money. I mean, and
and we shouldn't penalize success in your particular field or what have you, because you've done it so well. I think the only time when things get questionable is when, let's treat the government as a referee. When you start to put your hand in the referee's pocket and slip him a 20, that's when, we're not playing by the rules, like you alluded to earlier, in the same facet. Like, there's no competition, or the way the system is set up, if you create a product of some kind, some conglomerate, either in tech or in food or something else, will come and swoop you up to ensure that they stay on top, because the likelihood of your success is so minimal. If somebody's going to buy your freaking product of some kind, whatever that is, service, and they offer $1 billion for it, 99% of the time you're going to take it.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing, and I don't know, I'll take the Shakespeare quote from Westworld, right? Like, these violent delights will have violent ends. It's kind of like, look, I don't know if I would actually argue that Roosevelt was a traitor. It was probably more, well, here's the thing. If you push people too far, right, like, you get a much more serious problem than a higher tax bracket. And so you also have to ask yourself, on a lighter note, what kind of country do you want to live in, right? Is this something where you're rich and you want to bunker up and put a taller wall in front of your house to keep the poor people out? I mean, I think I mentioned it. Did I mention earlier the mailbox? People break into that? Yeah. So, it's like, well, I don't know. I can put the fence in front of my house, make it higher. I've got money to do that. Like, that's not a problem. I mean, I can stop this being an issue, but it's more of is that how I want to engage with it? Do I want to fortify myself behind a wall? And I'm not rich, but you know what I'm saying? Like, the mentality, I think there's a lot of people that realize, like, hey, it's actually to everybody's benefit to to look at these things. And I think what's happened, and this is what I was talking about earlier with some of the pathologization of the conservative party, is like, okay, let me make sure I finish this thought, because any portion of it will easily be taken out of context.
Sure.
But what's the Marx quote? The redistribution of wealth, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of become like a dirty word, right? Everybody's like, oh, that's so bad, that's so terrible. Well, and look, I don't agree with socialism, so I think the way people use it is bad. But we need to be honest with ourselves. Like, capitalism is the redistribution of wealth, right? Just the problem is right now we're redistributing it to like the rich people. So the issue we have is we have a system where Bezos is getting richer, and this isn't about Bezos, but you know what I'm saying. I'm going to use, he's kind of too easy as a scapegoat, I guess. But it's just like, you have these individuals getting richer, and then everybody else is getting poorer. Now, look, I like making a buck. I don't blame anybody for wanting to make some money, right? My problem is that, morality aside, you're just eventually going to like have a divide that the only way you can maintain an artificial divide where you have, 1% of the country controlling half of the wealth, right, is through aggression and violence and like an artificial force, right, where you have to control the government, you have to control the police, you have to make sure that, quote unquote, the riffraff stay away, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually very bad, because I mean that's how you get the French Revolution, right? I mean, it's not to anybody's benefit. Like would Marie Antoinette, if she had been, instead of saying let's let them eat cake, been like, whoa, we need to get the poor masses some food and we need to fix this, would that have actually been a traitor, or would that have been somebody that just got in front of the issue?
Yeah.
And helped everybody? Because I think we have this false paradigm of like win-lose scenarios, and I think it's like, it would help us all to start looking at things to go like, there's got to be a win-win in here, where maybe it's not ideal for everybody, but it's the right way forward.
Yeah, just kind of what you just mentioned reminded me of a book by Sebastian Junger. It's a guy who was a war photojournalist, and he was in Afghanistan and some other places. But he talks about war parties and hunter parties within like Native American culture, and how when you went off to hunt, obviously it was a big deal. And he talks about the scene like after they were able to get something, and if you never shot anything or you never were able to accurately hit something, right, and you took more of the score, like you were kind of ostracized for it, right? And so what do we have in today's society that doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum, keeps you in check? Do we have that inherently as Americans, or is that just a kind of a simple notion on, like you said, we're just so big, it's hard to do that, but at the same time, do our social circles and our communities at every facet of American society, do we have something like that kind of keeps us grounded? Is it community? Is it religion? Is it what?
I think we don't. I mean, I think religion has become phased out from the mainstream. I'm not saying there aren't many religious people, but that's not something that people like look to as a group, and at least not the country. I feel that when we look at the Constitution at this point, we don't agree about the history of the country, right? Like, I mean, there's totally different narratives about the history of this country, and I think that's what's killing us, right? Is that we don't agree about the rules, and therefore everyone's constantly offended about people breaking the rules. But if you really want to be blunt, like if you're an anthropologist, like a stranger in a strange land, and you just landed here, you would say, well, there's this like blue team and there's this red team, and they don't even agree on the rules, and they're just constantly accusing each other of breaking the rules. But they're accusing each other of breaking rules that they never agreed to. I mean, this is where the breakdown of the social contract becomes devastating for a society like ours, and that's why we need to figure out what social contract is, what it should be going forward. And I think what it is, like the current state, we need the conservatives to come up with a more positive message, right? It can't just be we're some sort of corporatocracy, we're all here to make a buck. And I mean, even this vision that we have of America in the past, like if you notice the things that we've celebrated, going to the moon, World War II, you know, defeating Nazis. I mean, these are massive things that America, I think, will be celebrated for in 1,000 years in the history books. But these weren't things that were solely individual accomplishments, nor were they done, you know, through some sort of like dystopian collective, right? I mean, we kind of, I think, are able to, you know, go back to that surfing analogy, to be able to surf this. And I think that's what we need to do. And I think the problem is both sides have created a false narrative where it's like, you know, individualism is not constantly the enemy. On the other hand, every time there's a social contract and we all kind of agree to something, that's okay, right? It's okay that we're redistributing wealth a little bit to make sure there's an even playing field so that like everyone has a shot. On the other hand, you know, that doesn't mean that everybody that's got money in the bank is, you know, the enemy of the people.
Right.
I mean, these are all traits. These sentences that I'm saying in both directions, if you've noticed, I mean, historically, these have been said across the world and they fail. So it's not even me saying, oh, I don't like this. This is making me uncomfortable on some moral ground. It's just, you know, fleecing the rich of all their money is a trope at this point, and it just doesn't work. At best, you know, you get Zimbabwe. At worst, you get the French Revolution. And on the other hand, you know, having just the wealthy with money, I mean, you know, I won't even go with a real world example. It's just like, I don't want to live in Blade Runner. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
This is just not where we want to go. So, but it's kind of sad. I feel like I am. I mean, you know, that orange sky during the fire, I mean, that literally looked like Blade Runner. The sky was just orange. The sun was blotted out, middle of the day. And I don't mean like light orange. I mean, it was just like this parlor color. And, you know, you've got the homeless encampments and there's fires burning. I mean, it felt very, very dystopian. And for me, that day was important because it made me realize, like, we're really starting to head in some directions that are like, if you had told me 10 years ago we would be here, I would be shocked. And I'm just thinking at this point, it's much more important to realize, like, my bet is that we're all on the ship together and we really need to come up with a way to continue, or, I mean, you know, the world's moving on. They're not going to wait for us to get it together.
No, definitely not. You know, just traveling and seeing, you know, for example, how other people have treated the pandemic. You know, some of these other countries, you know, they do have autocrats in positions of influence. So it really, you can't really, I don't think, judge them accurately on their handling of the pandemic, so to speak. But
Yeah.
I look at the cohesiveness of the societies, and it's their own folks, right? It's not like an American model where we're inviting, you know, the best and the brightest to come and be part of our team, right? This is what they have, and it's not looking good overall,
Yeah.
across the world, because I think that complacency that you were referring to about the suburban child or what have you, that's setting in all across the world, and
Yeah.
the people that are in power have it that much easier because there's no adversary challenging them in that capacity, unfortunately. But I think through that, and people don't understand that, like, through that adversity comes the change. Through that, you know, and sometimes, you know, people just, we haven't had it in our particular lifetime, but it's going to be violent, you know? And I think a lot of people don't realize that. And, you know, people will talk a good game per se, but I think that these movements that have come up, the minute that the one ups the ante and takes it to a violent level, it's going to be a very interesting time in the US, because I think that I still believe in our institutions enough to be able to handle and quell that situation, but at what capacity? If it's everywhere, you know what I mean? Like, you can handle a Portland, but can you handle Portland, San Francisco, LA all at once, you know, kind of situation?
I actually think if the heat was turned up, we'd probably handle it better. I'm gonna be a little contrarian here and say this. I think our problem right now, because I've been talking to a number of people that I work with that are friends of mine that are our age and younger, and something I've noticed, Ben, is that because you and I spent enough time around the military and overseas, I think we're old enough that we remember an era where like American dominance wasn't just a given, right? It was more like okay, this might actually not go our way, like in a very real way,
Right.
right? I mean, like I think you and I back in the day even had some conversations about like what was it like the Fulda Pass and what that would look like. You know what I mean? It was like these were dark conversations, and one thing that I've noticed as just kind of a meta trend is that there's this almost like assumption that America or the West like will always, if it really wants to, get its way. Like it's just there's almost like this undertone, and I think what it's doing is it's actually having a corrosive effect on our institutions because what people are doing is instead of saying, "Hey, we have to get it together so that the world is a safe place and to make sure that America remains strong and a good place to live and a world leader in a positive way," we just see these things as a given. So it's almost like, it's like when you have a family that's rich and they're just like fighting over who gets the Mercedes and they're not paying any attention to like what's actually going on, right?
Right.
And so I think, I mean, it could always put us over the edge and be the beginning of the end. I mean, who knows? But my initial gut is that if we felt like we were facing a little more of an existential threat, it might make us kind of really prioritize and say, okay, what do we need to do to be more unified, right?
Do you think something along the lines of the times after September 11th and how the country was definitely like kind of lockstep in sync with its overall purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that the response that we have in the future would be a little healthier than we did back then. But yeah, I mean, something like that, right? Where the problem is this: America's purpose morphs, right? Like a lot of countries are countries because, like those people have been that nationality. I mean, it's a country of blood, if you will, right? Like they're all related on a certain level.
Right.
In America, we don't have that. We have these ideas, and
Or nationalism over tribe,
Exactly. And so we take these ideas and we apply them to given situations. And I think we usually, I mean, there's obviously some major failings, but I think actually in general we've done a pretty interesting job moving the needle forward overall for humanity. I mean, there's again some notable failures there, but like there's a lot of positives, and I think the times we tend to do the worst are when we become complacent and we just start mist forest for the trees, right? And it's like we're just, whenever we become like, well, it's about the money, that's when like the worst comes out, right? I mean, pardon my French here again, but like shit, that's where a lot of the biggest arguments for slavery came from, right? Was this idea of like, well, but it's making me money, and you're like, I mean, wait a minute, you think it's okay to enslave people because it's making you $1? You know what I mean? Like it's mind-boggling where our heads go if we start to worship the dollar too much. And so it's very important that while the country remain efficient as an organism, if you will, right? Like we should use capitalism. We have to be careful because it can absolutely become this thing that can be, superseded by the wealthy or even by just groups to make that the prime purpose. In this country, when we do that, it really falls short. Like our most powerful moments are like the new Colossus poem, right? Give me your hired, the hungry, the weak. When we step up and fight for freedom and we really rise above, like those are the moments that were the most powerful. Ironically, you get like the ideal of liberalism and the ideal of conservatism at the same time, right? It's when we're at odds with each other that we have the most problems.
Do you think, I mean, obviously I disagree with the premise of people trying to judge our history with today's lens of what is right and wrong. They go back and try to reframe history based on that fact when they don't take into context the actual world was different back then. But at the same time, do you think Americans can handle truth? And what I mean by that, let's say, for example, I don't think that Dr. Fauci is a bad guy, right? But it was definitely a screw up in a sense of them not being honest with the public from the get-go and saying, hey, our mask situation is in short supply. Let's try to keep those for our healthcare workers to ensure that the front lines are stocked. Try to make use of, secondary items like bandanas, shirts, what have you, and we'll get what we need. But for now, this is the situation, right? But that's not what came out. It was like, yeah, they kind of work, and then like, yeah, we probably should get some, and yeah, you need to have them. And so with that being said, like that was an example of an institution of ours that didn't think that we could handle the truth. Do you think that Americans theoretically at this point in time could in fact handle truth from our government and from our elected officials in instances like that?
No.
And is that because of the environment that was created, or because of the nature and the inept ability to handle difficult situations, that like parenting and the way society has grown and as a whole, or just it's just not going to happen at this number of people?
I think all those things apply. I think for me, it's actually, I don't know if Americans have ever really been able to handle the truth. I mean, this applies broadly across the world, so I don't want to pick on Americans, but like, in America, like, you can buy what you want. I mean, the whole thing is about choice, right? And so you do have a large contingent of people that want the truth, and those people can handle it and they investigate for it. But you're always going to have a news channel that tells you what you want to hear. I mean, it's like today it's MSNBC versus Fox on the, kind of telling you what you want to hear on both sides. But it's this idea of like, there's just always going to be somebody that'll tell you that you're right. Right. And that goes with freedom of speech. So there's just always going to be somebody that thinks they can make a buck, making you happy, telling you what you want. And this is where the values become important, right? You need to have a contingent of people that just believe, hey, this is how it needs to be for it to function, for it to go. And I do think that while a lot of times people can't handle the truth, a lot of politicians do give it to them. And I think that's good, regardless of the handling of it. And I also think that there's a point where even if they can't really handle it, there's something that's like, there's a ring to it, right? So, hey guys, if I tell you, like, for example, I think one of the hard truths that we're gonna have to face over the next 10 years is long-term good, but short-term, it's the realization that like your average Americans are nowhere near as rich as they think, right? Because like when you add up debt, as other currencies start to become more valuable, the dollar will probably have to go down to, I won't get into the economics, but that'll probably happen. It's this idea of realizing that, right? And the fact that we need to value like, hey, instead of paying people minimum wage that's so low, we do need to raise that, but also we need to not raise it to a point where we're not employing people, right? We need to come up with ways to do this. But that's where you get, I'm going to kind of make up these terms here. That's where I feel like you get wealth though, right? You get rid of the poverty, because I mean, think about how much this costs us. Like, these tent cities aren't free. It's not like the crime comes from it, the mental issues people have, all of these things. It's not like we're riding on a free lunch. We're just spending things in the wrong places. And so I think we're going to have to increase what we put out there, but I think we need to be more selective about it, right? So it's almost like, hey, instead of cutting a smaller check, cut a bigger one, but really know where it's going. And I'm going to say something more broadly. I feel you're in hot water already if you're trying to look to the government for truth.
Right.
Just fundamentally. I mean, I don't know if it's, I think it's good when the government does it, but I don't know if it's the function of the government to be like your source of truth. I mean, I hope politicians deliver it, right? But I think what the government's supposed to do is to give you a solution, right? I mean, telling you that everything's bad, great, but that's not constructive, right? They're supposed to provide a direction. I mean, that's why they're there, right? So I'm not looking for my elected official just to be some sort of source of the hard truth all the time. I mean, I don't know if that's really constructive, right? It's more like, hey, what are we doing about it, right? I'm looking more for a narrative, and I hope the narrative is true, but I'm looking for that, not for just.
Yeah, no, I get it. I think that it's a balancing act of, and you don't know how you're like, you don't know how you're going to act until you're in it, right? The same thing with like in a relationship or a job, right? You think that this is what you're cut out for, and then you go down that path and you're like, maybe I need to reevaluate certain decisions in my life. And obviously that doesn't come after like the first day or whatever, but you know, in a sense of 2-3 years down the road, and you're kind of like, maybe I need to rethink this in that sense. And that's okay. But I hate in society currently that you can't make a change. Like you are fundamentally this way, and then you're not allowed to change your mind in any facet, regardless of the information that comes in and gives you insight on possibly making a change. And people just are trying to hold folks accountable and hold feet to the fire for no other reason than you've altered an opinion based on new information.
Yeah.
And
I mean, our current political setup isn't very constructive at this point. I mean, if you want me to be blunt, even the dividing lines between the beliefs of the parties to me don't make any sense.
right.
Like just even where the fault line occurs, and you have all these one party, or not one party, but one issue voters, like single issue voters.
Yeah.
I think that there's a huge opportunity for either party where there's this middle ground of the country that is pregnant for change, right? Where they desperately want something better. They want a path forward that doesn't exclude them. They want to be a part of it. The American dream is ironically what we're fighting over here, if you want to be clear, right? Like nobody like is like, I hate America, really. They're more just like, what is it and what is it going to be? And there's a big argument about that. I still think there's actually more that unifies us than divides. And what we need to do is we need to actually really celebrate that. I feel what's happening in this country that's causing a failure is you've got, you know, the conservatives kind of off spinning doing their thing, and you've got the liberals kind of off spinning doing their thing. And then you have a lot of moderates, which I think make up the majority of voters, who are picking sides based on specific issues. But really most of them just want to like
live and let live.
Make the country like a good place to be and help people, and they want to get ahead, but they don't want to like hurt their neighbor. I mean, I really think most Americans are like that, and you just need to tap into that. And what we've done instead in this country is just, you know, moderate after moderate has either been silenced or just kind of gotten quiet, and they speak in this mousy voice, and it's like, but that's actually the voice we need, right? We don't need I don't need some hardcore right winger telling me that I need more wars, but I also don't need, you know, people on the left telling me that every single person that, you know, isn't sure about some sort of insert topic is the enemy and, you know, needs to be, you know, taken out. And I'm like, it shows in our politics. Like literally, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say 70 million something people voted for each of these candidates, and both sides are trying to completely disregard and validate the other. And I'm like, you can't cancel culture. And that, by the way, isn't a dig at the left, because I think the right's trying to do it too. It's you can't cancel 70 million people. Like, are you out of your mind? It just doesn't work. And even if you're morally correct, you just can't ignore that number of people. Like, it's not a way forward.
Yeah.
And so I think what we need to do is find that win, that thing that like everybody kind of agrees on. And I personally think education, some infrastructure reform, these things are all things that we all agree on. They create jobs, they move things forward. I think there's a number of other changes that we need, but really, I think when I really talk to people, the pain they're feeling is fundamentally, they just don't feel like they're represented by the government. You talk to right wingers and they'll tell you, oh man, you know, the government's a swamp and it's just out there to like spend my money, and you know where that rant goes. On the other hand, when you talk to people on the left, it's like, well, they think the government is like violent towards certain groups and not listening or not feeling their pain or helping them get on track. And
the irony is that they're both in some way right.
Yeah, 100%.
It's
Well, that is, if you want, that was the irony. But if you really want to be, not to be contrarian on that, but like the real irony is that they're both right, but there's no reason not to do the other part, right? Like that's what's funny is it's like, okay, sure, you're right, and I'm right. But what's funny is, right, but why not like step forward and run with that? Instead, what they do is they kind of stop and they say, well, I'm not going to help that other group. And it's like, but it makes no sense. It's massively self-defeating. And,
well, I always laugh because, when I look and I hear certain things, for example, about family values, right? What I hear about family values, it comes in my head, and maybe it does with you as well, is compromise. I'm not always right. You know what I mean? And like, if that's what you're instilling, I agree with you. But you have to take that out of your own home and bring it out to the world as well. You have to compromise everywhere you go. You can't treat somebody like a piece of shit at work and then come home and then just be such like the loving husband or wife that you are, in that sense. And it's like literally a Jekyll and Hyde situation as far as your values are concerned. Like, I just don't get that from a personal perspective, Ultimately, this conversation has been interesting, to say the least. I'm trying to just have to maybe do it some other time again, and kind of have a little bit more. I mean, this was definitely more free flow, but I think there was a lot to unpack and kind of figure out, obviously I think that we're both concerned, and I think that's a start.
Yeah. I'll kind of close out with this comment, and maybe we can use this as the pickup for a comment in the future, a conversation in the future. But the hypothesis that I'm operating off of is there are a lot of issues that we have to deal with, but the core issue is that inequity is the enemy, right? Like that is the thing that is causing the 100-headed hydra, right? Where all these other issues either exist or are made worse because of that. And so the question is how do we resolve inequity? But I feel like what the left is trying to do is some sort of like, redistribution, and it just doesn't work, right? I mean, as we've seen in history, and I can't blame them for trying, because at least, they're trying to address the problem. I feel like the right sometimes just says, well, this isn't a problem. And you're like, but it is. And we need to come up with a way forward, or to your point, it's going to be bad, right? Because this will resolve itself somehow. And we still have a window where we can pick how we want that to play out. And there's a lot of really positive outcomes. So that's why, again, the prisoner's dilemma, I think, is very relevant, where it's almost like, hey, look, you might have all these issues, but, let's really address the problem here, which is inequity, and how can we do that in a way that, keeps the country strong, has a healthy, vibrant society, and a good place to live. I mean, that's what everybody wants.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, our weakest link is going to be our biggest issue, and if we have such a gap between the top and the bottom of our society, I mean, we've basically gone back to feudalism, in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, well, corporate debt and the debt structure, it's a much kinder version of it, but I mean, it is the feudalism glue that holds modern society together. I mean, let's not bandy words here, right? Like, now, having said that, you need an ordering system. So I don't know if having an ordering system is bad, but when you look at it from that light, here, I'll use this analogy. Okay, and this sounds a little negative, but it's like, if you think of the human condition as something that has to be dealt with, right? Like, people are a little bit greedy and don't always agree, and how do you make that work? And I look at communism as, it's the you have cancer, but we're going to tell you to eat organic fruit, and it's like, it sounds good, right? Like, great, but you're probably going to die, right? Like, it just won't work. I feel like capitalism is probably more akin to chemo, where it might keep you alive and it's better than just eating organic fruit, but there's some serious side effects, right? Like, this isn't a trivial thing. And I feel like the position a lot of people are taking is, well, it's better than eating organic fruit. And I completely agree. But I also hope that the modern doctors that are working on cancer cures aren't just like, well, shit, chemo works. Let's not try to come up with something better. And I think that's what my biggest fear is like, I feel like people are trying to make this false choice. I'm like, we have an unprecedented level of technological change. I mean, what are we going to do when cars start to auto drive and the entire like transportation sector becomes unemployed? Like, these are serious issues,
right?
And we need to get out of it. And this inequity, had too much coffee. It's making me mispronounce words. Is the killer. It's the problem we have. It's just going to get worse. It's going to keep rearing its head. And we really need to start developing tools that don't destroy our society or the engine that makes it move forward, but also keep it functional, right? Like, we really have to address these things in an open-minded way. And we're never going to get there if we just work off of some wish list of how we wish the world worked. But also, we're not going to get there if we just say, well, it is what it is. And, decisions be damned. We should just keep the situation as it is, because both are complete roads to disaster.
Right.
And I think we really need to have active people thinking about how the parties approach these problems. Otherwise, we're in big trouble.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, man. It's been fun to catch up, and I know it's a little more serious than probably what we normally talk about, but I think it's just the time to be having these conversations, at least to engage thought and get more people involved as far as talking and getting different perspectives, because your truth is obviously different than mine, and vice versa, but the same for others. And nobody's walked our individual shoes, and I think we need to have empathy for others that essentially, are still on a path that may not have been as linear as ours, and ours wasn't linear at all, but in a grand scheme of things has been pretty steadily linear over the time and the decades that we've been alive, and some people just haven't had that fortune. And I think for me personally, it was when I failed hard in business where I began to have that kind of empathy where to no fault of your own, didn't matter how hard you worked, that you just needed to understand that, like, it's okay to fail if it's not because of your effort. The show is produced and engineered by myself, Ben, out of Denver, Colorado. Be sure to subscribe to our social media or wherever you consume content, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Big shout out to Mike Xavier. Thank you so much for letting us use your music as part of our show. Be sure to check him out as well on social media. And stay tuned for the next show.